Hi, my name is Valerian Zunza, and I will be going over the 1920s today, such as inventions, events, and how art was influenced with so much going on. I hope you guys enjoy and get to know more about the 1920s. An event that occurred in the 1920s was women gaining the right to vote on June 4th, 1919, and it was ratified on August 18th, 1920. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, and at that time, it was really hard for women to project their voices, but the leaders of that campaign were women like Susan B., Alice Paul, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But obviously, there was way more women committed for this to happen. These were just the main campaign leaders. Another event that occurred, which wasn't really an event, it was more of what they called this time period, is one of my favorites to talk about. It was a decade of economic growth, which I will mention some inventions that were made at the time. This was a time of rejecting many traditional moral standards, dressing up, dancing, and basically having fun. To add on to that, this was right after World War I, so this was the aftermath, and people would get really creative and bring forward bold movements. I also wanted to quickly jump back to women gaining the right to vote because I feel like this was such a powerful time for women, and it was really a time for them to get creative, and there was so much art made by women because they were happy. Another event that occurred was the League of Nations, which was an aim to stop wars, and it was quite successful in the 1920s. It improved people's jobs and lifestyles. There are so many more events that occurred in the 1920s, but I will be moving on to inventions. A big invention that was made in the 1920s that we still use today would be television. It was pretty helpful back then because it gave them access to news. Since a lot was being done and going on, they could get important information from TVs, and not only TVs but also radio. They obviously didn't only use TVs for information purposes, but also entertainment. There were TV shows back then. I'll mention 3, like Upstairs, Downstairs, Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, and The House of Elliot, and obviously many more. Then there were vacuum cleaners. Obviously, this was a thing for a while, but it just kept improving after years and years. But in 1920, Ohio was the first to add on disposable bags. And now I will be covering art influence in the 1920s and how I think all the inventions and events that I mentioned really inspired people to get creative, or how their art connected back to everything that was going on, or all these inventions made, how they got creative with it. Earlier, I had mentioned about the Roaring Twenties, and I think this really is what mainly inspired art because this was such a time of people coming together, getting creative, getting into even photography, as was mentioned, because they started taking black and white pictures. And I think the 1920s really influenced art because this was the year of bold movements, and this brought a lot of changes in the way that society viewed itself. I also read this article, and it was talking about how experimental is the best word used to describe the artistic trends of the 1920s art decade. Something that was really in the 1920s was Art Deco, and it was a dominant style. And one of the most famous artists of the 1920s, which was the Art Deco period, was Tamara de la Pica. I don't know if I'm saying that wrong. She was a bit different from like Art Deco artists because they often drew inspiration from nature and used curved lines, but she uses curved lines as well. And this was really around the progressive era, and she had really high styles, paintings of nudes. Yeah. I also wanted to talk about that by looking at like politics and cultures in Europe in 1920s and like a little bit of the 30s. This really does analyze the innovations in the paintings of fashion, architecture, jewelry, crafts, furniture, etc. Someone that I wanted to talk about was Georgia O'Keeffe because she first became popular in the 1920s, and she's still celebrated today for her depictions of nature scenes. her main goal was to abstract the natural world so that it becomes even more appealing visually. And I really like that this was probably my favorite one, because she really shows a very abstract way of nature, plants, mountains, flowers, everything. And as I read, it says that this was an extremely important role in development of American contemporary art. I feel like her paintings brought a lot of emotion and power because of the colors and how bright it was. Next, I wanted to talk about surrealism art, and I'll be covering this quick. Surrealism art. Surrealism was an art and cultural movement of the 1920s. It rebelled against previous forms of art. Their art displays were called anti-art gatherings, and they rejected all conventions of art. To conclude 1920 art world, I really think that artists were really challenging the norms and traditional ways of thinking, or viewing the world in a different way, and showing realistic paintings of how things really were in the 1920s. This article I read mentioned that themes were really concerning about sexuality, technology, social progress, and how they were dominant in the culture of art in the 1920s. So it was a very raw era, and I feel like since World War I had just ended, people were showing and expressing their feelings about it into art and really showing very raw descriptions of it. Also, I did want to mention that a lot of the pictures that I just showed were created by Paul Nash. He was a surrealist painter and a war artist. So this is my end of the 1920s, how art was influenced and a bunch of events that happened, and how these events influenced these artists to become so creative. Thank you, and I hope you guys enjoyed.